often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode, I will be in conversation with Mark Wallace, an American professor of religion at Swarthmore College, where he teaches courses on religion, environmental studies, and interpretation theory. A self-described Christian animist, Mark's teaching and research interests focus on the intersections between Christian theology, critical theory, environmental studies, and postmodernism as a part of the field of ecological theology. Through his work, he seeks to bring together biblical faith and the liberal arts. He has written several books, including When God Was a Bird, which won the 2019 Gold Nautilus Book Award in the category of Religion, Spirituality of Western Thought. It was this book that convinced me that Mark was a must-have guest on Liturgical Rebels, as his perspectives gave me so much to think about concerning the image of God, not just in human beings, but in all the natural world. Mark, it's a real delight to chat with you today. I read When God Was a Bird a couple of months ago, and it really did quite impact me. And as I just mentioned to you before we started recording, part of the reason was because I come from Australia, which is in so many ways the land of birds.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being a part of my podcast. Now, but before we talk about your book, I want to get a little bit of your background. I understand that you became interested in theology through a sermon by Billy Graham,
Yes.
but you've definitely moved a long way from that perspective. So tell us a bit about your background and your journey into your current perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you for hosting this podcast and for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you. I was raised in Southern California in a world of wild sage and the bird called the roadrunner and the ocean and the sky, and in a world that while Southern California has become badly impacted by development and freeways and so forth, I grew up at a time when the agricultural industry in California was moving in a different direction, and there was open land, small hill communities, and this wonderful Mediterranean climate that was able to grow up in. And in the midst of that, I didn't have much religious formation, but a childhood friend, when I was a young adolescent, invited me to a Billy Graham crusade, as they were called. And this individual gave this stirring sermon, and it persuaded me to become a Christian in a certain manner of speaking. When I explained this to my mother, she was like, "Mark, you've always been a Christian. You were baptized in a church. So what are you talking about?" But it was a powerful born again experience for me, and it held through my teen years and a bit into college. But then I started to study academically the origins of the world's religions and the origins of Christianity, and began to try to bring together the spiritual yearning of my childhood with my now developing intellectual interest. And the best way now as an older man that I understand that connection is my teacher at the University of Chicago was a French philosopher by the name of Paul Ricoeur. And Ricoeur, although he's passed now, also tried to bring together his religious faith and his philosophical aspirations. And Ricoeur said what he was looking for was what he called a second naivete. He said the first innocence of childhood and childhood faith was lost to him. But he didn't want to embrace a critical perspective that didn't open up to the possibility of mystery, wonder, and awe, and an attitude of openness to the divinity of the world, if you can put it that way. And so he developed a philosophy that he called the second naivete, a kind of adult faith, an innocence, but an innocence that passes through the fire of criticism and intellectual inquiry and critique. And it's in that spirit that, while I'm not a follower of Billy Graham, I honor that first fire of evangelical fervor that caught my attention. And I've always wanted to preserve that that sense of mystery and awe and wonder in the interiority of my heart, while in the region of my head be critically aware as to what religion truly is about.
Well, I often think that evangelicalism is young faith in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And as we go on in the faith, I think many of us long more for that focus on mystery and wonder and awe. That I think is what God intends for us to, move into.
Yeah.
And but often we need that kind of exposure, because I had something similar as a teenager. And I think we often need that in order to give us the foundations from which the rest of it can develop, I think, at times.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So you say, too, that your research and writing focuses on the emerging field of religion and ecology, which is one of those areas that very much excites me. And you focus on how different religious traditions have shaped human beings on the environment in ancient and modern times, which is very interesting to me, and I think is such an important area of study today. Can you tell us a little bit more about your interest and how it's shaped where you are today, too?
Yeah. I mean, I think this interest in the conversation between religion and ecology comes out of passion and love on the one hand, and a sense of crisis and impending catastrophe on the other. So this is very much an emotional dynamic for me. Passion and the love comes. I mentioned my childhood growing up in the foothills of Southern California, and taking in, for example, drafts of wild sage at night before falling asleep as a child, and feeling this aromatic kind of presence in the wild sage plants that surrounded my childhood home. I mean, this was a richly sensual, visceral, palpable experience of what I later came to call sacred nature. I didn't really have the vocabulary at the time. I just felt I was in the presence of something aromatically that was a kind of natural perfume that was infusing my spirit with pleasure and wonder. But by the same token, I also saw how, talking about my childhood upbringing, how development in Southern California was destroying the ecosystem that supported wild sage plants that grow very close to the surface of the soil. If their root structure is disturbed, the wild sage doesn't do well. So there was this terrible sense of 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 joy and wonder, and of loss and attrition that was already starting to take place. Religion and ecology is a field that brings together those two dynamics. It starts to think about the natural world not as incidental to divinity or as irrelevant to religious faith, but as inseparably related to a person or a community's faith orientation. And it also helps emotionally people like myself cope with that terrible sense of loss that comes from the compromise in biodiversity that now characterizes our time, and climate catastrophe, and the warming of the oceans, and the loss of habitat. And I could go on and on. That 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 terrible sense that we are losing something precious. You often don't know that you're losing something until you're in the midst of the loss, and then you recognize, oh my God, I took for granted what it is I'm now experiencing, that like a rope of sand is running through my fingers, and I can't stop the sand running out of, running out of my clenched fists. It's happening even as we speak. So it's that religion and ecology as a field of inquiry interrogates the quality of the natural world as a sacred place, and it also helps to assuage our fear and anxiety and pain over the loss of that sacred place.
It's interesting. Probably 15, 20 years ago now, I started asking people, what makes you feel close to God? And the number one thing, of course, that people say is some aspect of nature.
Yes.
And I always cynically say, and what do we do in church?
Yes.
We cut out nature,
Yes. Right.
in so many churches.
Right.
And I'm sure it's a grief to God, when we started building huge temples that kind of cut out the presence of nature. I think that was, anyway, that's not something we'll talk
No,
about today, but
it's true. I just, one footnote to that, the church I attend, it's a Presbyterian church in the suburb of Philadelphia on the East Coast of the United States where I live, and it's a lovely built structure. And you're right about that. Churches as built structures often shut out the natural world as irrelevant to, or even as inimical to, worshiping God. But my worship in this church, in part, is grounded because I like to sit under a stained glass window that
yes.
features the American environmentalist Rachel Carson.
Yes.
So, you have stained glass in this church of Jesus and the saints and so forth and so on. But you also have in this church stained glass of as it were, secular saints or modern saints.
Lovely.
And there's Rachel Carson uh, with her books, The Sea Around Us, and others, that helps to ground me in that experience as integrated also with the natural world, not just built structures.
Well, that's lovely that, they've got things like that, which so few churches do.
Right.
But yeah, just that whole thing. And even talking to, people that wouldn't call themselves people of faith, they'll say they feel close to something divine
Yeah.
when they're in the midst of a grove of trees or,
Yes.
some other aspect of, of nature. And I think that, instead of buying into, my husband and I are very interested in Celtic Christian spirituality.
Hmm.
And one of the things, of course, there is this tremendous recognition that God speaks to us through the creation. That was part of what really resonated
Right.
with me. And I think that the rebirth of understandings like that is just so, so
I
important
agree.
for
I
us.
agree. I
Yeah.
agree. And that's really where my work and my spirituality, Christine, it emerges at that intersection
Hmm.
between, you could say, historic Christian thought and the lived reality of God in the everyday natural world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
And
yeah.
I think that's the way it's meant to be. So, yeah. Well, moving on to talking about your book.
Mhm.
Um, uh, When God Was a Bird. I know you've written other books as well, but this was the one I wanted to focus on. One of the concepts that particularly intrigued me was the idea of the creatureliness of God.
Mm.
That this isn't just some kind of imagery that we should think about, but that it really is an aspect of who God is. I just found that intriguing. God is a dove, particularly in the creation story and in baptism of Jesus, the burning bush, the speaking to the donkey, so many aspects of this. So, um, tell us a little more about this concept, because I think it's something that many people would not only find intriguing, but would really like to learn more about.
Sure. No, I appreciate you asking about that. This is really important to me, and it reflects my recognition that uh, in many ways the Christian religion has been handed down to us. Now, not um, Celtic Christianity, so that's an exception to this, and that would be an important tradition to look at. But other um, other Christian traditions have been bequeathed to us in a way that ignores the the possibility that God had and continues to enflesh God's self in material life forms.
Hmm.
In some ways, this shouldn't be surprising to Christian types, to Christian folk, because the grammar of Christianity is a grammar of incarnation.
Hmm.
That God, in the way I would put it, enfleshes God's self in in fleshy material forms.
Hmm.
But in fact, Christianity has become not a religion of incarnation, it's become a religion of discarnation. It's become a religion that actually, contrary to its own core teachings and traditions, a religion that prioritizes divinity as separate from everyday reality.
Hmm. Yeah.
God is divorced from the material world. God, like in the Presbyterian church I attend, God is invisible
Hmm.
and immortal and all wise. God isn't implicated in the muck and the mire of everyday existence.
Hmm.
God isn't an animal or a bird or a bush or any of those things you just mentioned. God um, is immaterial, invisible, and bodiless.
Hmm.
This is the uh, image of God that Christianity has constellated around, in large part because early Christianity was and early Christian thinkers had a kind of legitimation anxiety about the emerging Christian religious tradition. They didn't want it to become contaminated by the paganism out of which it
Hmm.
emerged. And they worked hard to render God what you might call a sky god, a god that exists out far off into the ether somewhere, not an earth god who is inseparably related to everyday mortal affairs. The problem with that is, and just to quickly mention two instances of this, the imagery for God in the Bible is earth-based, not sky.
Yes.
So in the early creation story in the book of Genesis, the author writes that the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. This is a literal description of how God interacted with the material world. And the Hebrew word there for hovering describes what a mother bird does on her nest. So God is pictured in feminine and earth-based terms in the inaugural creation hymn of the Bible. God isn't a distant, bodiless potentate. God is a mother bird who hovers over the great egg of creation.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's right there in the Bible, bringing everything into existence. But that was an inconvenient truth for early Christian apologists. It had deep resonances with as it were, non-Christian Greek and Roman and pagan imagery. And so the Bible, even though it makes these kinds of claims, was understood differently. And then in the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, that same image of the mother bird is repristinated, so that in all four of the Gospels, Jesus is understood as being baptized. And as Jesus is being baptized, the writers of the Gospels say, and the Holy Spirit, as a dove, came down and alighted upon Jesus. So I think of Jesus, his hair is glistening wet. He's coming up out of the River Jordan, and a bird, a dove, maybe a pigeon, since doves and pigeons are related to one another, came down and nested on him, just like the mother bird did in the book of Genesis.
Beautiful.
It's
So beautiful.
the mother bird again, the feminine aspect of God, of Christian divinity, alighting upon Jesus. But again, Christian guardians of the sacred tradition were embarrassed or shocked or inconvenienced by this understanding. So they quickly moved that into the realm of metaphor, figurative speech, of decorative language. Well, of course, God isn't an animal. That can't be the case. Because we know that that's not the case, and yet the language for describing God, in the way I would put it, in feathering God's self as a sacred bird, that language is the same language used to describe the incarnation of Jesus in human flesh.
Wow.
Now, the theologians were fine with that, but what I think of as a double incarnation, not just the enfleshment of God in Jesus in human form, but now the enfleshment or the enfeatherment of God in animal form as a dove. That's the other member of the Godhead in Christian thought, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit manifested itself or herself as a dove in the Gospels, and that got relegated to the level of metaphor, whereas the understanding of God as enfleshing God's self in human form was elevated to the plane of a literal description of what God did in the incarnation. And I'm just gently suggesting, Christine, that that's a mistake.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. This really excites me. I'm a very keen gardener, and the images in the Bible that have really brought my faith alive have been similar kinds of concepts in terms of God as gardener.
Yes.
Starting in the Garden of Eden, and God, reaching down into the soil and
Yes.
forming humankind. And then the one that I love, in fact, I have an icon of this up on my my office here, is of Jesus as gardener of the new creation.
Mhm.
And Mary thought he was the gardener.
Yes, that's right.
And the importance of that, again, that enfleshment
Right.
and connection
Right.
to the whole of creation.
Right.
These images are so exciting.
They are.
If we would only grab hold of them
Well,
and immerse ourselves in them,
No, and think about it, just to expand on what you just said, the prelude in the book of Genesis to God creating Adam and Eve from the muck and the mire of the soil, which, by the way, the Quran, the holy book of the Quran, also makes the same claim that it's out of molded clay, wet clay, that humankind is made. But the prelude to that is that in the book of Genesis, we read that God walks about in the cool of the evening,
yes.
calling out to Adam, where are you? What happened here? So you
Yes.
have this primitive or primordial understanding of God as ambulatory, as
Yes.
moving about, and is calling out with God's voice. A very rich, enfleshed, embodied, inhuman understanding of divinity in that inaugural creation story. And then the reference you made to the Gospel of John and to the other Gospels of Jesus as a gardener. So is Mary mistaken?
Yeah.
Yeah, or does she recognize in this pastoral figure, in this individual who tends to gardens and plants and vegetation, something profound about who Jesus is, underscored by, at least in John's gospel, Jesus' insistence that Mary and himself let go of each other because they're touching each other. And he says, please stop touching me. And in the Greek, the New Testament was written in Greek, and the word there for touching that the Greek author used is the word haptos, Haptos. We sort of have that now with an electronic digital media's haptics, but it's the Greek word for deep touching, not a light glance, but a deep touch. And so the way I think of it is that the gardener and Mary are deeply touching one another. And there's something beautiful about their embrace in the midst of this rich botanical, agricultural garden
Yes.
imagery.
Yeah, it's just, and it adds so much depth to our understanding of the story. When we put it in this context of the creation and God's interaction with creation at all these different levels. I just love it. Now, one of the people that you talk about who had a deep nature religion, in which he integrated the sacred and the nature, was John Muir.
Yes.
And of course, a lot of people is, oh, no. And so tell us more about how you interpret his faith and the relevance of that to your own kind of sense of faith and worldview.
Sure. John Muir is a fascinating figure in American environmental history.
He
19th
is.
century Scotsman, but he was born, grew up in the United States, but had rich Scottish heritage and
Celtic.
Celtic.
Yeah, there's
Exactly
something
right.
about the Celtic connection to
No,
the
that's
earth.
exactly right. So
Yeah.
we've come full circle in that regard. And Muir himself didn't see any contradiction between, and I really want to emphasize this point, his worship of nature as divine and his worship of the God witnessed to in Christianity as the center of Christian faith. Now, interpreters of Muir have often split on that.
Mm-hmm.
And many interpreters of Muir today said, well, John Muir left his childhood faith, or he rebuffed the religious orthodoxy that he grew up with regards to his father. But like in Celtic Christianity, there is a marriage between, if you want to put it this way, the God of the biblical witness and divinity within all things.
Mm-hmm.
These are not contradictory affirmations.
No.
God manifested God's self, not just as a bird, as we talked about earlier, but, for example, in the story of the burning bush in the book of
Mm-hmm.
Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, God becomes vegetal. So God becomes many different forms throughout God's own evolution and growth towards what God hopes to be. And to think about God in botanical or vegetal terms, or to think about God in non-human animal terms, deepens for us an understanding of the inseparability of the natural world on the one hand and the divine world on the other. But going back to Muir, Muir didn't have any problem with seeing that connection, but interpreters of Muir, again, have often split on that.
Yes.
And unfortunately, not unfortunately, but fortunately, rather, I should say, if you read Muir's actual writings, the infectious enthusiasm he brings to his celebration of sacred nature
Mm-hmm.
Should give the reader a clue to the fact that for him, the 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 biblical world and the natural world that he inhabited, those two worlds are one and the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think so. It's fascinating to me. Now, over the last few years, of course, we've started to become more aware of the complexity of the world at the microscopic level
Yeah.
around us, and the microbial filaments. I'm reading a book at the moment called The Light Eaters, which talks about plant intelligence
Yeah.
and fascinating stuff. Um, and but one of the comments you made that made me realize the dire consequences of our destructiveness of killing off species is you say, if God is a bird, then what is the sense of loss, not only biologically, but religiously as well, when innumerable members of a particular avian species are senselessly slaughtered?
Yeah.
You very soberly state that in killing birds and animals, we're also killing God.
Yes.
And I was thinking of an article I read just recently that talked about the number of birds that have been killed by running into buildings.
Yes.
And how something like 30% of the death of birds, of migrating birds, is from running. I was devastated by that. And what are we killing?
I know. I know.
Yeah.
I was the agony that I brought to that writing reflected my understanding of not just the decimation of avian populations today, but also as I thought about the death of certain species of doves and pigeons that have been wiped out, that in Europe and the United States. Now, I don't know this about, say, Australia and New Zealand as well, if this bird was characteristic of those bioregions. But in Europe and the Americas, there were at one time, roughly 100 years ago, billions of a particular sacred dove called the passenger pigeon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That flew in great flocks over the landscapes that I now am fortunate to inhabit, and all the 4 or 5 billion in the Americas, and the 4 to 5 billion of that bird. So roughly 10 billion, just one species of bird, passenger pigeon, like the ancient rock dove that alighted upon Jesus at the River Jordan 2,000 years ago, that roughly upwards to 10 billion birds of that one particular species were wiped out over the course of a few years through habitat destruction and through harvesting the birds for meat and so forth. How then is it possible for us to talk about not only the emotional despair that we feel over that loss, but what that does to God? That's what I wanted to get at there.
Yes.
That if we wager the risk that God has fully poured God's self out into the world. Throughout the Bible, there's a phrase that's used continuously, that the Spirit will be poured out onto all flesh.
Yes.
Right? It's in the Hebrew Bible. It's reprised again in the book of Acts, in the New Testament, and so forth. This promise of the Spirit being poured out onto all flesh. This is like also in the Gospel of John, where the writer says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Flesh in the Bible is everything.
Yes.
It's not just human flesh. It's non-human animal flesh. It's trees. It's insects. It's bodies of water. It's landscapes. It's rocks themselves. Jesus at one point said, if you try to silence me, and you try to silence my followers, in the Gospel of Luke, he said, even the rocks will cry out.
Yeah.
So he understood. I think of Jesus as what I call an animist, a person who understood that and felt that the sacred was in everything, that God was in everything. Jesus understood that even rocks have the ability to communicate God's message, that this way of understanding the Spirit in all flesh is a powerful affirmation of God's palpable presence in everything. But if you live that truth, and then all of us as humans in this period of the Anthropocene, all of us then are participating and are implicated in the destruction of the world. We are implicated in the destruction of God's flesh.
Yes. Yeah.
With God, and with that impact, God is now, this is my painful affirmation, Christine, God is now suffering loss and degradation and the continual violence that we direct against the planet. And so I think of Jesus's death as a death where he was scarred by the arrogance of his human tormentors. And I think of that now as a paradigm for understanding God's body, not just localized in the person of Jesus, but God's body now understood as the planet itself. The planet itself now bears the marks of Golgotha. The planet itself is being crucified. Flesh is being...
Yeah, I agree with you, and I certainly share your pain in so many places. In fact, I remember, one of the things I think that many of us kind of had a momentary awakening was during COVID, when suddenly there weren't, there wasn't traffic, there weren't planes and everything like that. The air was clearer. It was like it sparkled. The birds were louder. We had coyotes and other creatures and deer coming back into our neighborhood. It's like, wow, what have we lost?
Yes.
That we've kind of, and it's because it's happened slowly,
Right.
And I know of lots of other, I'm a physician by training, and I think of so many things that we've lost, because of our destructiveness and the illnesses that are caused
Right.
by the destructiveness to the environment at so many different levels.
Right.
And it's painful. It really is
Right.
painful.
I agree. And that to me is when Jesus cries out on the cross in two of the Gospels when he's being crucified, my God, why have you forsaken me? He feels the sense of alienation and loss in relation to his Father because he's now undergoing this terrible death. That I believe in that moment God also felt that loss. That's
Yes.
not a private experience peculiar to the crucified Jesus. It's a trauma within God's inner life. That is also what I think is happening now, if I can be so bold as to speculate about that. What also is happening now in the inner life of God. This is a tragedy for us and for other species, and this is a tragedy for God. This is a tragedy for God as well.
I think so. Well, I was going to ask you what you feel the central message of the book is, but I feel we've covered that pretty well here. Is there something else that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So that book, When God Was a Bird, created the sort of condition for now the book I'm writing now. And the book I'm writing now, I might call it Can Beauty Save the World? And it's a way of understanding the necessity for people of faith now. Again, if I could be so bold as to say this, Christine, for people of faith to worship the natural world. This, for me, is the next step. It's the practical outworking of what I did in that earlier book on God taking on avian form. Now I want to argue that people of faith, Christians, others, we should set ourselves free to worship the natural world as divine. And how to do that in a Christian context. There are many times now when I've participated in church services outside of churches.
Wild church.
Yes, wild church, exactly.
Yes.
And it travels under many different names.
Yes.
Forest church, Celtic Christianity,
Yes.
animist Christianity, wild church. All of those movements are efforts to knock down the walls of churches, so to speak, and bring people into a place where they can find God in the everyday world.
Yes.
And that's not just permissible, but actually essential to human well-being and the well-being of the planet. In fact, I think we won't be able to blunt the impacts of climate catastrophe if we don't find a way spiritually and emotionally to reconnect to the planet.
Amen.
And worship, literal worship, is a way. It's not the only way, but it's a way to find back through the sort of camino of the heart, the way of the heart. It's a way of finding ourselves back into an attitude of adulation and wonder with regard to the natural world that's religiously saturated.
That really, again, resonates with me because I write about wonder. I wrote a book called The Gift of Wonder. And, I mean, I do a lot of research on the impacts of wonder on our lives and things like that. So, I look forward to that book. I really would. So thank you, Mark, so much for being with me today. This has been very stimulating for me and I think for all of our listeners. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Christine. Okay. Yeah. Bye for now.
In today's conversation, Mark Wallace and I explored the intersection of faith, ecology, and the divine. Mark shared his journey from a traditional evangelical background to a deeper understanding of the relationship between religion and the natural world. We discussed the concept of the creatureliness of God, emphasizing how God is represented in nature and the implications of environmental destruction on spirituality. The conversation also highlighted the importance of figures like John Muir in bridging faith and nature and the need for a spiritual reconnection to the earth in the face of climate change. In the next episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will be in conversation with Brian McLaren, friend, activist, and author. Brian has recently written a sci-fi novel, The Last Voyage, which will be the focus of our discussion. As an avid sci-fi reader myself, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and the insights Brian brings to all that he does. I am Christine Sine, an avid gardener, liturgist, environmentalist, seeker after justice, and speaker on spiritual practices. I am the author of Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path, and The Gift of Wonder. My other books include Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening, and To Garden with God. I also write regularly on Substack at Walking in Wonder with Christine Sine. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.